What is evident here? A bad day for a dog? A story of friendship and devotion during crisis? Sad effects of peer pressure? Come on, it'll be fun. Yeah. Certainly there is a story here that bears investigation. Happiness is perhaps our universal desired outcome. This dog doesn't look very happy. But like an iceberg, 90% of the reality is unseen by the casual passerby. There must be something unseen, even serious, in concluding that the problem is short-term and easily solved. Now, physics tells us that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. People are like that as well, especially babies. When hungry, they cry. When wet, they cry. When hurt, they, yes, cry. This is normal, not because they have a limited vocabulary, because even once they become verbal. Many adults, when hurt, cry or strike back, or when uncomfortable, whine and blame. Like water at 32 degrees Fahrenheit freezes, there is no freedom or agency in a reactive state. What is needed is a separation between the action and reaction, which then more appropriately becomes a response. But to create this separation, three things are needed: K, S, and D. In the absence of any one of these, there is no agency, only slavery to circumstance. The D stands for desire. One must possess the will or want to, or no response will ensue. The K stands for knowledge, what to do, why to do it, and what will be the consequences or results. The S stands for skill. It isn't enough to know what to do if one doesn't possess the skill of how to do something. When repeated, choices grow into habits. But no one choice, or even one habit, can determine our life's outcome any more than eating one piece of broccoli will make one healthy. It is rather a series of choices based on desire, knowledge, and skill, establishing a resultant path towards the desired outcome that has and is creating our current and future state. Universally, this desired outcome, as indicated in the title slide, is happiness. One great American described this universal yearning, happiness, as the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. Agency, then, is the freedom to plan. Let's face it, though, knowledge of the outcome of our choices is not always what we predict. Perhaps the sources of knowledge upon which we depend in making our choices are at least as important as the choice itself, but more on this later. Perhaps a thinking model or protocol in meeting our daily icebergs would be helpful. All of us have faced the reality of pain. Customarily, our media culture teaches us the plop, plop, fizz, fizz mentality, and for some it seems to manage the pain. But is that the solution? As in healthcare, all life's challenges, whether resulting from our choices, others' choices, or simple mortality, there are three stages, the knowledge of which will empower our responses. There's the cause, the condition, and the symptom. Most often our awareness and hence our responses focus only on one of the three. Let's use this match as a beginning of our metaphor. In this example, faulty wiring has caused a fire somewhere in the remote part of your house one night while you were sleeping. The ensuing condition spreads very gradually within the house, but you are peacefully sleeping and blissfully unaware that precious possessions will be consumed and your life will be threatened. Fortunately, the smoke alarm in your bedroom is finally affected. We can readily see the connection. But upon awakening to that irritating noise, all you can think is call the fire department. Now, what if they were to arrive in record time and then, after removing the smoke alarm, informed you that you could now rejoin your blissful dreamland? We would demand that the condition that caused the smoke alarm to scream be investigated, eliminated, and the cause be discovered and addressed. Now, since this is a healthcare example, it might be interesting to note Research presented at this year's annual meeting of the American Psychosomatic Society in Miami, Florida, found that ruminating on a stressful incident can increase your levels of C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation in your body. It was the first study to directly measure this effect. Inflammation, in turn, is a hallmark of most diseases, from diabetes to heart disease, cancer, and Alzheimer's. Stress, as a universal cause, includes, however, physical stress, trauma, accidents, injury, and so forth, chemical stress, medication, diet, environment, and so forth, and mental emotional stress caused by worry, fear, anxiety, and so forth. Well, a principle here might be, in identifying solutions, we should be thinking in terms of what is the cause behind the condition and the symptom. We must become cause thinkers. Now, that is not to say that some symptoms and conditions don't need immediate attention before turning to solving the cause. Physical stress solutions include, but are not limited to, avoiding trauma, risk management, in other words, ergonomic management, exercise, and proper amounts of sleep. Chemical stress solutions include, but again are not limited to, understanding our medications, our diet, managing our microbiome, and environmental control. Finally, as important as managing both physical and chemical stress is not what happens to you, but is a result of the story you tell yourself about what happens to you. You see, many with potentially debilitating physical or chemical challenges have used those challenges as stepping stones to happiness and success. Well then, we might conclude that the cause of causes is the mental emotional stress. Well, most of our deepest stress originates with our interrelationships. Here we have two individuals who disagree about something. This is how our stories develop in what might be called the perception cycle. We witness or experience what we might call an event. From the event, we form a conclusion. Our conclusions or judgments stimulate feelings. Now, feelings don't have a life of their own. They result from the conclusions we've drawn. Let's take an example. Suppose you were waiting for your significant other to come home. They had indicated that they'd be late, but couldn't give you an exact time, so you pass your evening watching television. During one of the breaks, you hear footsteps approaching. Now, what are your feelings? I guess most would feel relieved or some other happy thought. But suppose just before hearing the footsteps, a banner appeared on your screen warning you of an escaped convict in your neighborhood with instructions to lock your doors and notify the authorities in the event of a sighting or incident. Just then you hear footsteps. Now what are your feelings? Well, they might include fear, desperation, alarm, and so on. So here's the question. Is there meaning in the footstep? No, the meaning comes from within. The footsteps in both instances were the same. We assign meaning based on our perceptions, our conclusions, and so forth. Now, feelings stimulate behaviors, which aggregate to become our experience library from whence we draw our next perceptions. So, how do we change our perceptions so that our behaviors will be responses rather than just reactions? This seems cyclical. Much could be said here that would help us develop and manage what is being called today as emotional IQ or EQ. But again, wanting to think in terms of causes, one author has written, "We form our beliefs for a variety of subjective, personal, emotional, and psychological reasons in the context of environments created by family, friends, colleagues, culture, and society at large. After forming our beliefs, we then defend, justify, and rationalize them with a host of intellectual reasons, cogent arguments, and rational explanations. Beliefs come first. Explanations for beliefs follow. I call this process belief-dependent realism, where our perceptions about reality are dependent on the beliefs that we hold about it. Reality exists independent of human minds, but our understanding of it depends upon the beliefs we hold at any given time. Well, a principle here might then be the cause of causes is in your head, including our perceptions, worldviews, mental maps, or paradigms. The stress generates from the story you tell yourself and others about those perceptions. In part, this path to happiness and away from stress is built one phase at a time by acting to fulfill personal needs. We all have inborn needs as human beings that press for satiation and even drive our thinking and planning. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is one of the most well-known efforts to sequence our needs and desires and will help us conceptualize such a pathway. It begins with physiological needs, our need for food, water, and shelter. These are the survival needs common to us all. Next comes those needs related to safety and predictability. Group and personal security are found in law and order, which originate from this shared sense of need. Love and belonging follow close behind in social relations, growing from individual longing for group affiliation. But sometimes fulfilling this need is sought before the previous needs or as a means for such, especially by youth, longing for acceptance. This often leads to poor judgment relating to safety and security, and even makes them dependent on so-called friends for food and shelter. Now, this need of esteem through recognition or achievement drives man to yearn for respectability. Next, even in cases of popularity from social esteem, there is an inner sense of something missing. Man has an inner need for self-actualization or fulfillment of personal potential. Okay, the principle thus far. The key to happiness begins in our head and then requires action by building solutions in sequence. But the dark side of learning to prioritize our need fulfillment is that humans tend to worry while waiting for results. The problem is that worry is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it just doesn't get you anywhere. In fact, worry is found to be only 20% thought and 80% fear. Fear, like all feelings, comes from our thinking. We are taught to play the doubting game, which, though negative, is the prime mover for scientific discoveries. But doubting that what we have is adequate also drives fear thinking. Well, what if? Our problem may be that the believing game has been discredited, as if believing something, even for a limited test period, could become malignant and consume our belief system, leading to creating our own truths, designed only to fulfill our wants and needs regardless of reality. But, you see, you can only know that some things are true if they are accepted and we act as if they were true, at least for a short experiment. In doing so, we discover things only found by experience. The side effect is that we also, thereby, build a trust in the source of the information we're testing to be true. The key seems to be, then, to turn our doubts or fears into legitimate questions and honestly seek for answers. After the believing experiment, one then reverts to the doubting game, allowing for critical thinking, whereby evaluation of results can be checked against evidence and peer verification. So here's the principle. Learn to question effectively rather than worry or doubt. Evidence and verification are important watchwords in the search for truth. But as objective as we try to be, there are subjective realities we must face. In a classroom setting, half of the class is asked to close their eyes, Group A, while the other half, B, watches this. Then the two halves trade and side A now watches while B naps. And this is shown. Then both sides are asked to shout out a letter, the first that comes to their minds as they complete this word. Side A invariably says, I, making the word ripe. Side B mostly says A, making the word completion rape. So the reality is that whatever we consume enters our core, our heart, and becomes part of us. To control the core, one must control one's eyes, one's senses. We become what we consume through our senses. Discipline your senses rather than fall victim to them. And now, because our center or our core becomes the source of our guidance, which means the source of our direction, which helps us interpret life's events, set standards, and becomes the source of our values. Whatever is in the center becomes the source of our wisdom, the source of our balance, judgment, discernment, comprehension, and integrates them into our reality. Whatever is in the center becomes the source of our security. In other words, our self-worth, our identity, our emotional anchor. And whatever is in the center becomes the source of our power, the strength to act, to choose, to overcome, and to cope. So, if we were to put different things into our center, we could test using the what if in an experiment. Let's place our bank account, our portfolio, or our net worth. A good steady income and saving investment accounts and our sense of security with self-worth is high. We feel anchored. Our values revolve around acquisition and spending. Our power to cope with life is at an all-time high. But what if the economy failed? What would happen to security, wisdom, and power? You see, more than one stockbroker committed suicide after a Black Monday's market crash. So let's try something more humane. Our co-workers, perhaps, or the club to which we belong, or our neighborhood, or our friends. Again, what's the problem? If something happens to the relationship, then far more than membership is affected. Let's try something more personal, something more in our control. Our family, or perhaps our spouse. Any problems? Oh my, yes. Divorce, a rebellious child. Again, more than important relationships are affected. All of a sudden, with a divorce comes all the feelings of failure, identity crisis, no power to make decisions, and so on. Would putting church or organizational positions or callings work as a center? It is so rewarding and a great source of respectability. But once released, or when changes come, what happens to our security, guidance, wisdom, or power? And so what could occupy our center, our core, and be unfailing? Each of us must search for that which fits and works. This is why many have chosen a divine center. Now, depending on your personal metaphysics, God should be all-powerful and unfailing, even when our expectations of God may turn out to be a problem. Choosing to put God in the center in order to have at our core an unfailing source of guidance, wisdom, security, and power requires that we have a correct understanding of God's character and attributes, lest we put faith in what we expect of God rather than who God really is. Many an atheist is created from believers who were disillusioned by an event or information that didn't fit their understanding of the nature of God. Here's a principle, perhaps. Choose a stable center, one that won't decay or be stolen. Something or someone that cannot fail, or the failure of one's center will ripple to collapse one's capacity. Now, there are several concepts that relate to our center and help determine what we will choose as such. We want to explore their meanings. Our metaphysics, sometimes called our ontology. Our epistemology, rationalism, empiricism, authoritarianism, and our axiology. Perhaps these are new vocabulary words we might explore together. Metaphysics is our view of reality, including who you are and how you originated. Epistemology is how you believe knowledge is acquired that you can trust. Rationalism is knowledge from reason or logic. Empiricism is knowledge from observation. It's the scientific method, hypothesis, theory, law, so on. Authoritarianism is knowledge from outside of self. It is necessarily resident in an authority, which could also include God or experts. Axiology are our values. Quote, whether he recognizes it or not, every person holds to a metaphysical position, trusts in at least one system of epistemology, and holds a personal axiology or set of values and ethics. Furthermore, these areas of our own philosophy are interrelated. Our metaphysics, or our view of reality, influences our epistemology, the way we gain knowledge, and together the two determine our axiology, or our values." Unquote. In the effort to know truth about who and what we are and where we came from, we find vast differences of opinion. Our metaphysics is inextricably linked to our epistemology, or how we know, what sources to which we look and trust. In the vast philosophical library of proposed means and methods of knowing, there are three that represent all of them. The first is rationalism, that is, to gain knowledge by thinking and warrant it by rules of logic. Fields might include philosophy and sociology and so on. Empiricism is to gain knowledge by the use of the senses through observation, using the scientific method of hypothesis theory law, and then validated through measurement, repetition, and peer review. Fields would include anthropology, astronomy, agronomy, chemistry, physics, and so on. Of course, there are many fields that rely on both sources, such as general science, history, medicine, and most of us think in those terms. That is, we accept things that we observe, but then are logical and reason them through to arrive at our own conclusions. The last is authoritarianism. This is kind of an aggregate concept, but their common feature is that knowledge must be gained from outside of self, in other words, from an authority. Now, atheists would reject the concept of an omniscient deity, but might look to a martial arts teacher or a plumber for targeted expertise. Only God could serve as an absolute authority, at least the concept of God as an all-knowing and all-powerful being. Truth might be defined as the knowledge of things as they were and are and will be, but fields could include any of the above as well as religion. Again, there are overlaps because most of us unconsciously or not use all three. If the authority of God is accepted, most religions rely on texts written by someone whose learning was divinely sourced, authoritarianism. And now the theist must rely on study and logic to understand and apply their understanding of what the authority God said. What if instead of debating between them, however, all three were used to discover the truth and verify each other? Anciently, in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ directed that the seeker was to ask, seek, and knock. When seen in contextual and philosophical terms, ask is to turn to an authority, to pray, as God is that ultimate authority. To seek is to study it out in one's mind for rational consistency. To knock, then, an action, would be to empirically apply, through acting and or obeying, the principles taught, followed by observing and analyzing the results. This might be seen as a pathway, then, to divine communication. Answers to prayers follow studying to gain understanding and experimenting by acting, and then asking, and then trusting in God's authority and willingness to answer, thus allowing one to grow trust in this divine source. Putting all this together might look like this. The theist understands in their metaphysics that God is their creator. How they learn of God's nature, expectations, and all other pertinent things defines their epistemology. Flowing from both their metaphysics and epistemology is then their axiology, defining their values by which they live. Whether atheist or theist, some epistemological limitations should be noted. First, the logic of rationalism does not always bear out over time. So not all that is logical is true. Available knowledge is limited, so as more becomes accessible, other conclusions could become logical. Empiricism relies on evidence gathered by experience through the five senses. Conclusions derived from that evidence are subject to the observer's bias filter. And secondly, since discovery continues, the conclusions must remain fluid as more evidence is gathered. And thirdly, since authorities are mostly people, bias is again a concern. If God is accepted as an authority, we must ask, does he still speak? If not, then all conclusions about what God said are subject to human bias again. If he does speak, then one must ask, how can I know? And are those subject to my personal filters also? So here's perhaps a principle. Choosing a stable center that won't decay and can't be stolen might be done by experimenting with one's metaphysics, using all epistemologies so that they verify each other, and test and prioritize your values. So the solutions for the mental-emotional stress might include meditation, scripture study, prayer, recreation, social involvement, crisis management skills, and emotional IQ or EQ skills. So if we could compare ourselves to an olive tree, we might conclude that the value of the tree lies in the quality of the fruit. We all want to make a difference to bear fruit. All fruit trees have two main parts, the branches and the roots. In this metaphor, the roots are the invisible part. In other words, our inner person. The health of the root depends on our investments in that inner person through meditation, prayer, worship, scripture pondering, selfless service. Since the branches are visible and serve as the means used by most to evaluate the health of the tree, they might be compared to our public investments of time and energy, including our professional education, portfolio investment, training, our connecting socially, and our work, etc. In olive trees, if the root-branch balance is disrupted, the good fruit normally seen is replaced by bad fruit, or wild fruit. In other words, the tree continues to yield fruit, but it becomes wild if not enough attention is given to the roots or the branches. If we focus too much, for example, on our public successes at expense of the private victories, our fruit or our character, our influence becomes wild or bad. Likewise, if we ignore our public responsibilities and positions, yield very little, if any, fruit, and thereby make little difference in our personal happiness. Now, balancing our focus, our time, and our efforts so that both the roots and the branches of our person are regularly serviced yields the fruits that finally make the difference and brings the happiness we so desire. Can we agree then that what we choose as our center from which our security, wisdom, power, and guidance flow gives us the balance needed to make us fruitful? So the principle is, balance your root and branch energy and time investments. What is in our heart and functions as our capacitating and guiding center depends on where we are progressing in our hierarchy of needs. For a person on the physiological level, nothing is as important or dominates his thoughts more than food, air, water, and so forth. Even on this level, food is of no dominant concern if he is drowning. For one struggling with loneliness, the promise of achievement is buried by their hunger and focus on finding group affiliation. In fact, as noted earlier, many of our long-term stresses and failures come from getting these out of order, and thereby being seduced by the hope of fulfilling our real need with the offering of one from a higher level. For example, the seduction of recognition without achievement offered by a group seeking followers can lure us into joining and participating in dangerous activities in the hope of being accepted. For years, Dr. Maslow felt that self-actualization was the pyramid pinnacle of our need hierarchy. Age and many interviews with successful people created the need to revise that hierarchy, however, by adding a final need, the pinnacle. This was something he called self-transcendence. Though he was an atheist, he came to accept that people yearn to transcend their self-focused purpose and be part of something global or even cosmic. He defined self-transcendent as a motivational state in which the person seeks something beyond personal benefit, for example, the furtherance of some greater cause, union with a power beyond the self, or service to others as an expression of identification beyond the personal ego. Well, these puzzle pieces come together to form our mental map, our worldview from which our values flow. These values, in turn, serve as significant landmarks on our map. Those landmarks, like a map, serve as indicators for navigation during our direction choices. These values, flowing from our metaphysics, are formed by what we learn through our epistemology. If we feel strongly about something, we act on it. Then as we act on these feelings and form habits through repetition, we come to value them. The order isn't set. Sometimes we like the way we feel and it becomes a value, and then we try it and it's anchored. Sometimes through acting we come to feel strongly and the feeling comes from the doing, and we adopt the idea as a value. This pyramidal model of our growth through our human needs might be overlaid on another model, one of acquirable habits that we can learn in growing from dependence on others towards true independence, equivalent to the state of self-actualization from Maslow. These 3 habits from Covey allow us to purposefully and incrementally fulfill our human needs by acquiring the skills needed and taking responsibility for those choices. This pinnacle state of self-transcendence could then be achieved, according to this Covey model, through a series of 3 additional habits that lead to a powerful and influential capacity of interdependence, whereby our knowledge and expertise is teamed with those of like desire, thus synergistically multiplying our agency and effectiveness. Perhaps a principle again. Continue growing towards interdependence through self-transcendence. But it all begins with our metaphysics, or our ontology, which is informed and expanded by our epistemology, until we grow our effectiveness capacity through our axiology. Our selected central value will then generate our sense of security, guidance, power, and wisdom. If this center is carefully selected, it will enlarge our capacity, reduce our stresses, and increase our capability to meet life's challenges with inner peace and joy until we acquire this powerful combined unity of interdependence through self-transcendence. This is a daily process, however, requiring that we balance our time and energy investments to both roots and branches, inner character and outer responsibilities. These principles, then, will actuate happiness as the object and design of our existence, and will enable it to be the end thereof as we pursue the path that leads to it. Find and solve causes behind the conditions and symptoms. The cause of causes is in your head, your perceptions, your worldview, and mental maps. The key to happiness begins in your head, but requires action to build solutions in sequence, and learn to question effectively rather than worry or doubt. Believe, then analyze, then conclude. Learn from it, then start the cycle over. Believe, analyze, conclude, and so on. You become what you consume with your senses. So, discipline your senses rather than fall victim to them. Then choose a stable center, one that won't decay or can't be stolen, one that is not vulnerable to another's agency. Experiment with your metaphysics so as to inform your center. Use all epistemologies. They should verify each other as they conduit your metaphysics into your center axiology. Connect and test your values constantly as you qualify your center. And finally, grow towards interdependence through self-transcendence and maintain that process through your root-branch balance of time and energy focus. It happens one day at a time.